that fits perfectly with my camera hacking. See, and I also, like a lot of people here, probably I have too much time on my hands. So that's a major reason why I hack. Quick history of the disposable cameras for people who haven't heard of them. They're made by a company named Pure Digital in San Francisco. And they make 3 versions of still cameras and 1 camcorder. And they're still in business. They've been in business for a couple of years. And their basic business model is you buy the camera for a really cheap price, reduced. It's kind of a lease, but it's not really because there's no contract. You take your pictures and then you return it for development, and then you pay them extra money and they'll give you back photos or a CD or a DVD, depending on what it is. Works out to be about $1 a picture or $2 a minute for the video camera. So it's not cheap, but there's no commitment. The first camera was in 2003. Very basic camera, 25 pictures, 1.2 megapixel, no screen, just a little LCD frame counter. You can buy these cameras unhacked for about $10 now at Target, or just cheap ones. And then the second generation was much cheaper to produce, 25 pictures, it's about the same thing. They were basically just reducing their costs. The problem with these cameras is that they have built-in memory. And that memory you cannot expand, you cannot remove it, and that's their lock-in, because they're the only people who can access that memory. They're the only people who can develop your pictures, supposedly, and that's how they make their money. But the PV2 is neat because it has a feature that it didn't have before. It has a LCD screen on the back, and you can use that for previewing your pictures, or you can, if you want to delete a picture, you can see it before you delete it to know that it's bad. And then the third generation is our camcorder, and it's 2005. 20 minutes of quarter VGA resolution, and it still has an LCD display. You can preview what you're recording, and you can play back only the most recently recorded video. And you can delete that if you want, but you can't go and play back your first video unless you delete the second video. But it's still very useful. All these cameras come with a secret connector. It's hidden under a sticker, and it's interesting. So the question is, why hack it? First off, cheaper pictures. But what's kind of neat is, since we've done this, is that people have used it for different purposes other than what the original manufacturer intended. They put them in dangerous places by giving them to kids. There's one teacher that bought 5 of them and handed them to his first graders. It's also the lightest camera, especially the camcorder. You get 20 minutes of recording video on 21 grams without the battery. So it's just something you can't buy even if you had a couple $1,000s to spend. And then you can also make it do new things. It's basically a computer. All of these, the ones with the displays, they've got a computer, a lot of memory, a lot of RAM, and a display, and a couple buttons, and an image sensor. So you can use it for anything that you'd want to program with, small and portable. And you can also improve it, which I'll get to later. But the number one reason is that sticker that says it cannot be connected to a TV or a computer. gotta test that. So let's start the hack. Before we even open up the case or anything, there's the 3-finger salute, which, just kind of playing with the buttons, you see what it does. We found out that if you hold the record and delete buttons down while you power it up, then it will go and show you a special screen, and it will show you the firmware version, the camera serial number, and the hardware version. So that's some information, but it doesn't really get us anywhere. It doesn't do anything special. So we got to start opening the cover. And inside there's the LCD and the buttons and battery holder and everything. And on the other side we've got the bunch of more parts. We've got the secret connector up there at the top, just kind of nondescript, very cheap. We've got the lens and sensor on a little separate PC board. It's a really tiny sensor, even tinier lens. Cheap, but it works. There's the main processor. There's the memory. It's got 32 megabytes of memory, which, if you imagine, like 10 years ago, 32 megabytes was pretty good, but now it's basically given away. And 128 megabytes of flash memory, which 10 years ago was pretty amazing too, but see, so we've got the secret 10-pin connector, which doesn't have any documentation, and there's certain tricks you can use to figure out which pin does what and how to hook up to it. And one of the tricks of the trade is determining where the ground and power pins are. And usually those are pins that are on the PC board that have a lot of surface area. And if they're exposed, that's a good chance that it's ground. And if it goes to a screw hole, that's even a better chance that it's ground. So you can see up at the top there, that signal is probably ground, and in fact it is. And then you can use a multimeter. Doesn't have to be too fancy, but you can trace that either visually or with the multimeter electrically to the pins and figure out which ones connect to that ground that you found. And then there's another trick. The power and ground pins have, there's a couple other things to identify them with. First off, they connect first. They're furthest out on the connector. So when you connect up to the connector, to the camera, those touch first, and that's good for static electricity. It helps dissipate that and protects the camera from damage. It also makes sure that the data pins are not supplying the power. The electronic circuits, if you can power things with the data pins, which they're not designed to, and that can damage them. And then also bigger traces, many vias on the PC board usually indicate power just to carry the higher current. And then, of course, using the multimeter, if you can find a chip that has a known power or ground, you can measure it and see if it connects to the connector on the secret connector. So next up are the data pins. There's some tricks for that too. They usually connect up last. They're further into the connector. They have thinner traces, and they're often symmetric. So in a close-up here, you can see those two pins both go to vias down there marked in red, and it's totally symmetric. Kind of an extreme case, but. And then just because it's a 10-pin connector doesn't mean everything has to be connected. There were 3 unconnected pins, and these used to be used on previous generations of the cameras, but they kept the same hardware for the reader, so they just left those pins in. And sometimes you get lucky. This is another device, the Z-View. It's a media player that's kind of locked, and they have a JTAG connector, and it's not marked or anything, but it's got 8 pins, and that's what the JTAG connector has. And if you look at the ground and powers on that, you can see that, and look at the JTAG specification, you can see that they line up and figure out which pin goes to what. So they removed that on the next version of this product. So there's lots of ways you can interface to these cameras. I'm going to guess a USB connection. It's popular, and from the little bit that we could find on the data sheet about the processor, it was supported. So it's a good guess, just a guess. And a USB connector has a power, ground, and 2 data lines. And of course, on this one you can see that the ground and the 5 volts are a little longer again, so they connect first. And we finally figured out that the pinout was ground, power, and there was a battery thing so that when they put the camera into the reader, they could tell if it had low batteries and whether they needed to replace it before they resold it. So we've got a USB cable, we've got everything. It sounds hacked. It's recognized by the computer. You can see it says Saturn where that blue line is, but it doesn't work. So we can try hacking known good drivers. We find drivers for similar products and change the vendor ID and product ID in the drivers so that they'll recognize the camera, but they still wouldn't talk to the camera. So we're kind of back at square one again. And that's when we look at the hardware again. And one of the questions is, this is a low-cost device. This is selling for $11 to $30. Why do they have so many chips? That looks like a lot of work to put that together. And obviously, there must be a reason for that. And the reason is that each kind of device is a different kind of process that they make the chips with. So the microprocessors are made with one specialized process that's good at high-speed logic. Another one for the flash memory is good at flash memory, and another one is for the SRAM is good at SRAM. So that helps us. Because this is a low-cost device, they try and buy it in bulk and bulk means it's standardized. So we can go to the JEDEC standards and get the exact standards for the flash and the SRAM. And that's pretty easy. The data sheets from all the manufacturers pretty much say the same thing because they're compatible, and it goes into excruciating detail. But the processor is a little bit different. It's a high volume part like the other ones, but unlike it, it's got very few customers. And by customers, I mean people who actually buy these processors and integrate them into their design. So there's probably about a dozen customers for the Zoran chip. And also, because it's a system that they sell, the software that comes with it is very tightly integrated with the hardware. And that usually means an NDA, which I probably wouldn't get. Not that people haven't tried, but and because it's all behind an NDA, the web search has turned up very little except for that this chip had a USB interface and a couple other details. So translation, we're boned. We don't know what to do. There's nothing further we can go there. So we have to take the next step, which is looking at the flash memory, which is the only memory chip on there that has persistent storage. And it looks like a kind of intimidating chip. It's a 0.5 millimeter pitch on each side, and it's got 48 pins. But luckily, half those pins are not used. So if you break them off when you're taking the device off, that's okay. If you got a good chance of it still working. So many unused pins. But the data sheet has the exact specification on how to read it. And it talks to, it has the sequence of signals that you need to give it to get the data out. And you just basically have to follow those from left to right, and it'll give you your data. So where I worked, we didn't have a good modern flash reader. We had an old flash reader, so I had to build my own. And I got unlucky. Some people have the newer flash readers. I use this just I/O card as a generic I/O card that you can control with USB. You can twiddle the individual bits and read out the data, and it's relatively cheap, $79. And then since the flash memory is so small, I needed an adapter board to get to the wires, and that was another $50. And then a little bit of software, and I had a homebrew flash reader, and actually I changed it to be able to program too. So just a simple program that goes and follows what the data sheet specifies and doing everything in order, and you get your data out. And alternative is a smart media reader. The chip is designed to standards, and it turns out that those standards are the same as the flash, as the smart media interface. And some people have tried that. You can get the data out. Unfortunately, the drivers for the smart media automatically fix error correcting problems, flash memory problems. And that kind of obfuscates how the chip works, and you don't get all the data. So you can get your video out, but it's a little harder. So eventually, one way or another, you get the raw memory image, and it's just 128 megabytes of stuff. And there's a lot to look at, and you have to figure out what's interesting, what's not. And some of the easiest ways is just look for known stuff. ELF, people have heard of that, or it's a standard memory, it's executable format that's used by Linux and Solaris and BSD. And we find some other things just searching. We find FAT12 for a file system. There's another FAT16 in there too. And eventually we can divide the whole 128 megabytes into different portions and start to make sense. And so at the left there we have the firmware. We have different FAT volume names, which they've nicely labeled for us. And we can break that out using DD, just the Unix DD, to copy out portions of the file into little subfiles. And we can take those ISO files and just mount them on the Mac desktop, and you can go in and read it. So any ideas what's in the big partition there? Got the videos. Yep. So the rest is just housekeeping kind of stuff, but we got our videos that we were looking for, and that kind of, I was able to play those videos, and that kind of acts as a proof of concept that the files are not encrypted, that somewhere in that device there's memory and we can read it, and if we can read it, we can play it. So that was a good start, but we had to take a whole board apart. It was a very painful hack. Some of the other stuff that was just kind of sightseeing you can look at the resource folders, and they have pictures that show on the LCD screen, like turning off or picture deleted. They also had some production line test stuff, like a color chart for calibration, which I'm sure that they go and license that. Not so sure. And in that version thing that came up with the 3-finger salute, it kind of looked like the Comic Sans Serif font, and I wasn't sure, but then there's a file called comic.bin, and if you look in that file, there's a Comic Sans MS, which kind of indicates it's for Microsoft. And Microsoft doesn't allow you to reuse that code, but the copyright law doesn't really allow fonts to be copyrighted if you translate the format. So they're, well, yeah, legal. And then there was an interesting file. It was called statfile.txt, and it had some information that no one knew about. There was a clock in there that's user never sees. Apparently, it's set at the factory. And every time you turn it on, it'll record the reboot, but it'll also record the date and time and the length of the videos you take. And I guess the marketing people figure out how many times you delete the videos, when you take them, what your average length is. But it's all hidden, and so kind of creepy. That's George Orwell. And then there were customization files that were in there too, in the other partitions. Included the things like the serial number, the unlock code, things for recording resolution and the time limit. So the last thing is the best part, the firmware. And for the 3 different kinds of cameras, there were different sizes. And as the cameras got more sophisticated, the firmware got bigger, 60K manageable, all the way to 1.2 megabytes, which is a little much. And that's not even including the screens that it shows. So this is all code and text. So the first way to attack it is just to look at strings, the Unix utility. You can find some stuff, some junk, but some stuff that looks interesting, like a sound file. Apparently it has something for correcting defective pixels. More interesting, you can find the operating system, the processor, and the compiler, and there's just a line in there from their compiler or their libraries or something that listed all that out for me, which was really nice, because the original data sheet on the chipset didn't really specify what it was, and now we know that it's LX4180 compatible, which is a MIPS processor. And you can find some other stuff too, like secret debug features. Apparently there's a serial port or some sort of terminal that you can hook up to it. We haven't actually implemented that. We haven't found out where those wires go to, but tons of strings in there that describe help functions for all the functions that you can get from that interface. And a little more information too, like the model number of the LCD and the sensor, which weren't on the packages because they were so small. And then a little quick thing about how the firmware is made. And basically it starts off as C code and it's up as the ELF file. And in each step we lose information. From C to assembly we lose the comments. And from assembly to the object code we lose the variable names, which can be really helpful. And then finally from the object to the ELF file, the function names have been stripped out, so that would have been really nice. But it's all gone. And so our goal is to go backwards on this chain, go back to regain that information that was lost, which pretty hard. So one of the questions is what CPU does it use? And oftentimes we can get lucky. We can find it blazed all over the chip, big letters, MX1, or we can find it in the strings like we found in previously, or you can guess it too. If it's an 8-bit processor, table assembler has a lot of different processors that it supports, and you can use that to debug and reverse compile the firmware manually and figure out which ones look like it makes sense. And if it's a 32-bit processor, there's less choices that you can go and find. So it's basically a guessing game. You just have to get research on different kinds of processors as you think it could be, and then manually disassemble the code and see if it looks sensible. So the manual disassembly is kind of a first start. We start off with some bytes and convert that to binary, and then look it up in the sheet, and it shows you that all those bits in those places means that the instruction is a load immediate register A2 with a 16-bit value. And so that's good. I mean, it took some work looking through the book, and that's just one instruction. But we really need a disassembler to go through and do it, the whole thing, 300,000 instructions instead of just the one, and do it in bulk. So there's two major choices. You can get free tools. My GNU Obj Tools supports pretty much everything that GCC does, so it's on a lot of platforms. And then there's IDA Pro, which I've heard great things of, but I haven't used yet. It's more expensive than free, and the support costs a bunch of money, but it looks pretty flexible. But there's this third option, and that's, since I'm doing this as a hobby, writing my own. So writing your own is actually easier than it looks. It's just converting binary numbers into text strings. There's a lot of examples out there that you can use, from simple 8-bit processors to 32-bit processors. So you're not starting blind. You can start with someone else's work. You can make it support any processor. One of the cameras had a very specific processor that no one had ever heard of, and the Wayback Machine had one page on it, and it just long gone, long forgotten. And we could build a disassembler for that, and it would be hard to change the other tools to go get to support that one specific processor. And then lastly, you can make it as smart as you need, which I'll give examples of. Here's a little bit of code here. That's just the initial output from objdump. There's no hints. I've stripped all the function names, the string names, everything. So we're just looking at just numbers. And we can go and look at some of these instructions and automatically add helpful comments. So those two instructions load up half of a 32-bit register, and the other one loads up the other half. And so we can make the disassembler go in and automatically put in a note in that says A2 is whatever value that is, and the other A is the other value. So that's the start. But we don't know what those numbers mean. They're just kind of numbers. They look like addresses because the address of the code is in the 8,000 range. And if we look in the code, sure enough, at that address is some interesting text. So we can make the assembler a little better, disassembler a little better, automatically include that text. And these are things that IDA Pro does too, but have to start somewhere with my code. So the camera version and the %S, we've seen that before on the 3-finger salute. So from that we can kind of infer that that function that we're calling is something that draws text on the screen with those parameters. So once we do that, we can start labeling all the functions as we learn about them, and automatically figure out which other things draw stuff to the screen, and learn more from the program from this one specific case. So some other neat stuff I found in there were debug text. And if a call to malloc fails, there's probably something that says that function XXX in file on command on line 37 or whatever failed. And that way they can trace the problem back and figure out why it failed. And there's lots of those. And it turns out that the firmware is made from over 200 different functions, and they're all listed. And what's neat is not only that we know the functions and the names of the things like mass storage, we can associate those names of source code with sections of code that actually reference those strings. So we know that one section of code is from the file device mass storage.c, which really gives us a head start on looking at where things are and what they do. And that's without even figuring out how the program works. So kind of lucky there. So there's other things in there too. There's a USB cam command, and I figured that would be a queue, and I disassembled it more and found that yes, it was. We can put that note that the command queue creation function has been found. And since we know the operating system, there's lots of documentation on that, and basically we can match up all those numbers with the prototypes and figure out which field is what. And so basically we can associate the USB command queue, that A0 register, with the variable name, and track that as it's used throughout the rest of the program, since the initialization is the only place that describes the text name of the queue. So just following those, we found 7 system-level threads. Some of these are just, you can tell by the name, servers, monitors. We found 11 timers, and you can tell that they're timer functions because some of them say video timer, audio timer. 22 mutexes to keep things from accessing the same function, same piece of data at the wrong time. 34 queues, and this is just a little simple camera. We found 64 transient threads, including my favorite, apps, edit, movie, fragmenter, main, preview mode, which someone had a fun time with that. And then we found 180 monitor commands, all with documentation. There was that built-in monitor, listed the command name and then the parameters for it. So that was a really good head start. A lot of low-level stuff that we could go and look at and see what it does. So taking that a step further, I put in a simple trace routine that would go and figure out which functions are called by what other functions. And basically, we had some initialization, some known starting points like those monitor functions and the names of those. And this function you can kind of tell is a low-level function because it's called by the shutter routines, the motor routines, the iris routines, the LED blink routines, and the GPIO, the general purpose I/O. So this probably controls a really low-level function. So this is a hobby, many months, and I'm not doing it on a timeline, so it's just relaxing. There's no schedule pressure. I've got to keep it fun. So many months. The second camera, the camcorder, took about 5 months. I'm sorry, the PV2, the still camera, took about 5 months. This one that I've been describing, the camcorder, took about 3 months because I had extra debug data. And eventually you start to find things interesting. And we found a USB cam command queue. We found a function, a task called USB agent that uses the TXQ send, and a command dispatcher which uses a queue that was labeled TXQ receive. So I built up a working model in my head of how it worked. And basically the idea was that commands come in over the USB function. They're picked up by the USB agent, which puts it in a queue, which goes to the command dispatcher task, which gets the elements off the queue, and then calls various functions to actually do the work. And it's a great model, but it doesn't work, because obviously it would be hacked if we could get commands in there and the regular drivers worked. So we had to wait a little while for some more pieces to come together, and 2 things happened simultaneously, kind of. Other people found that there was one function that one way to get some data back from the USB interface, and they basically tried all different kinds of numbers passed to it, and most of them just didn't do anything, didn't return anything. But they found out that if they sent something that started with an FE, that they could get a 1 byte returned or 2 bytes returned, and they didn't know what those numbers were, or it wasn't totally reliable. But it was interesting. We got it to do something, and so then I found a neat piece of code, and that code was this code. And basically it takes an input and discriminates whether it's 92, 90D, FA, FE, or FF, which that FE is the same as that they had been using. So it's kind of interesting. Why would you need a function except for some sort of locking mechanism? So yeah, I revised my model. Basically, I guess that most of the useful commands are locked, and that there's a couple unlocked commands that you can use, those 5 functions, and gain access to the rest of the commands. So that kind of helped me focus on those 5 commands to figure out exactly what they did. They were very short functions, and then figured out from that what they needed to be happy with. So it turns out that in the memory there's a challenge response, and basically the camera has a challenge and you've got to give the right response to unlock it. So there's a challenge, and you access the challenge and the response through these 2 functions. Give an example. Basically, you say, what is challenge number 0? You give it one of those commands, and it looks it up in memory, tells you that the first 16 bits of that challenge is 1, 2, 3, 4, and returns it back to you. And then you have to go back and figure out the correct response for that challenge, tell it to the function FA. It goes and looks it up in memory and compares it, And if it's correct, it'll tell you it's correct. Actually, it'll tell you if you're all done or if you're not done. So you don't know until you've given all 4 challenges and responses. So I don't know if anyone might see this coming, but if you ask the wrong questions, you can get sometimes the answer you're looking for. And if you ask it, what is challenge number 4? There's no challenge number 4 there. But in memory, that's the response that it's looking for. So it's really happy to tell you that, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then you just basically parrot it back. It goes and checks it, and oh, whoa, it's the right number. And it comes back and tells you. And you can do that for all 4 of them. And eventually it'll tell you you're all correct and you're ready to go. So just a simple failure to properly validate the input, just a massive, I don't know, there was a function in it that did it, it was wrong, didn't validate it right, took advantage of it. They fixed that. So camcorder's hacked, at least initially. So the question is, what if you're not so lucky? What if you have, like on the second version of the camera, you have no documented processor, you don't have the operating system like I found in the strings, and you don't have the thread names and the text messages, the text descriptions of what source files they came from. So the second camera had a processor made by Small, a very little company, and they bought another little company that made the processor, and that's why it was so obscure, called a V8 Micro RISC. The Wayback Machine had the 1 page on it, and it also had a test suite which described all the instructions and how they worked, and from that we could build a disassembler. We also had the USB captures from other Small cameras, the brand name Small, so we kind of had an idea how the protocol was supposed to work, but without the obvious locking that Pure Digital did. So the first problem is that we've got 128K of code, and from the processor documentation it can only access 64K. So we've probably got some sort of banked memory in there. And if you draw out the 124K of memory, it kind of looks like this. And you can kind of see the banks. There's about a dozen of them. And then there's leftover purple code there that's just empty, that's not used. So that helps us figure out what the banking scheme is. And then also, if you look at the beginning of each bank, you can see that there's a repeated pattern there. And that's the library code that's, when it goes from one bank to another bank, the other banks aren't accessible. So this library code for addition, 32-bit math, things like that, is repeated so that it can be used by all the code. And so that pretty much verifies that the banks are like we expected. So the cool thing about building your own tools is that you can look at the code and you figure out how it works. You can it had a totally custom method, and then you can add that information back into my disassembler and just make it work. So that was a large part about disassembling it. One of the things that we knew from the protocol was that all the packets started with a magic number, and it was either small or LAMS depending on the byte order. But we couldn't find that in the code. And strings, there wasn't a string, there was no like mem compare. So we finally found it, and it's 4 instructions, and it's all out of order SLAM, and it's just basic compares. It's pretty hidden, but just looking for the ASCII we could find that. And what's neat about this is that if you see the top line USB buff, we can find out where in memory it keeps the buffer for the USB packets. So we can figure out what it's doing with the rest of the bytes in those packets, and then figure out what it needs, again, what it needs to be happy to unlock. So lots of looking at the code, figuring out functions, trying to make guesses, and seeing what they do. And eventually hacked. So, and of course we have the obligatory vandalism. Hacks are just changing some of the fonts, some of the text characters in the ROM. So, both cameras had the same problem. They had validation problems with the input, and both in different ways they failed, but same basic problem. So I've got a little security analysis, and I'm not really an expert in overall security schemes, but I'll give it a whack. So I'm sure there's better people that can do this. But first off, first camera had totally security through obscurity. It relied on a secret formula for the challenge response, and that was stored in the firmware, and there's a secret formula. You take the serial number that you read out of it and you convert it to binary coded decimal, and with standard function you invert it and then you multiply it by 4, and it's not anything fancy. So the problem with that is that once you understood the formula, all of cameras were unlocked. There was no defense against it. I mean, they would have to change the camera and the readers. Just totally busted open. And one of the things they did is they only locked the download command to download your pictures. They did not lock the other commands. So there was a memory read command we could get and just read the memory direct. Just didn't have to go get it and ask it for the file system and everything. We just download the memory, get it out of there. So the second and third generations after that, they changed it, and they had 1024-bit encryption, which sounds really impressive because DES, the government standard, is only 56 bits. 1024, that's amazing. That's got to be secure. But so that's kind of a tip-off that people who use large numbers of bits of encryption, often it sounds impressive, but it doesn't really work. So I was wondering whether it's kind of homegrown or professionally done. So basically, there's 3 components of the software. There's the challenge generation, which is the 1024-bit challenge that the camera provides. And we found out that it was generated with MS-RAND, which is from some sort of old BASIC version that they use the same function in their C libraries. It's not too random. It's not really made for 32 bits. And actually, it repeats every 24 bits. So that 1024-bit security just went down to 24 bits. So kind of the first mistake. They fixed that in later versions. Oh, and one of the things, the way I found that out that it was MS-RAND, I took in some of the challenge bytes that they had, looked it up in Google, and sure enough, there was those sequences in other web pages, and I looked on those web pages, and they were using MS-RAND. So, and eventually, I went through all 24 bits of MS-RAND, ran it overnight, and found out that all the challenges we had fit in that pattern. So they have the response generation, and the response algorithm was not in the cameras. In the first one, it was that multiply by 4 negative thing, and so that was very good. It wasn't in there. You couldn't. There's no way you could get to it because it wasn't in the camera at all. But then the last section is the verification code, and that was chock full of holes. The 2 faults that I found were the range checking, which just let me ask it what the proper response is and give it back, and it worked. There's also a brute force flaw where if you gave it a partial answer that wasn't correct, it wouldn't make you start at the beginning. You could keep checking. So that turned the 1024 bits into 37-bit security. Still marginally brute forceable. And that was just kind of mediocre coding techniques. Obviously, they'd never tested it. Otherwise, they would have found these faults. And then, July 2006, we found a website, and kind of interesting. It had the camera programming software that generated the responses, the correct responses. Someone used the same cat yesterday, and I was like, oh no, I got to change my slide, but like the cat. So that's basically the keys of the kingdom, how they generate their responses. Basically, we can totally emulate their development station, and even if their code validation software is perfect, which pretty much it is now, we can still give it the correct keys. So some people downloaded that, kind of got threatened, so I'm keeping them anonymous. They found out that it was using RC2 encryption and that it was a 40-bit key. And they used the MS crypto library, so it was easy to look through and see that it was calls to different routines and figure out where the key was. Made it easy to trace. It was good because they use the MS crypto routines, which probably are going to do exactly what they say, but it was easy to trace. So it was an older version of the code, and it only had the keys for 2 of the camera models. They make different camera models. This one's CVS. They make them for different chains of drugstores, Walgreens, and they all use different keys. Unfortunately, the RC2 is 40 bits, and you can brute force that in about 21 days. So we got a group of people, and 5 or 6 computers, and we brute forced it over a weekend. And so we got the keys for the rest of the cameras that were not in that file. So that was pretty much hacked. So a little summary, what worked, what didn't, how to improve it. The architecture is, they removed the algorithm, the challenge response algorithm. It was good until we found it on the FTP website. But it's only password protection. It doesn't really do more than allow or disallow access. And it is still very vulnerable to implementation flaws. And they could have encrypted it, encrypted the video files, and that would have been really nice, because if they encrypt it with, see someone throwing their ball. If they, now I'm getting nervous. They, if they had encrypted the video files with a one-way thing that you needed another key to recover it, and that key wasn't on the camera, it would have been really hard to undo. Unfortunately, their software was not designed against changing it, and we could actually, like the Hacksword thing, we could change the software. There's just a simple checksum in it to see if it was valid or not. So we could have easily cut that part of the encryption routine out of the software so that when you recorded the videos, it wouldn't be encrypted. They could have also done it in the hardware, but that would have been really difficult. It would have required a custom hardware, and this is a low-cost thing, so they didn't want to do that. So security through obscurity worked for about 2 years, which is good because they had a really weak algorithm, either the 4-bit, I'm sorry, the 40-bit RC2, or they had the other even weaker one, which didn't last as long. Unfortunately, that weak algorithm busted it on all their products simultaneously. They should have used different, either a more robust underlying crypto, or done different kinds of cryptos for different products so they wouldn't all be busted at the same time. So that's really bad. Let's see. So one of the things they had going for them is all 3 cameras were different architectures totally, from 3 different manufacturers, 3 different operating systems, everything. And it didn't take them a lot of work to go and put in their locking code into each camera. So actually, I think the hackers did more work than they did engineering it. So that's a good for them, because that means that they can keep changing it, we can keep hacking it. There's always going to be a delay. And since we're open and they're not, we'll fix their code for them. So we'll show them the exploit. It'll get around. They'll know exactly which line to fix in their code, and they can fix it right away. And since the use model of these is you return it back to the store and they reflash it, and erase it and give it to a new customer, at that point they can update the software. So it's pretty easy for them to do that. And then the last thing is they're not even protecting anything really secure. They're not doing state secrets. The security doesn't have to be that high. And actually, they're not even protecting their own secrets. They're protecting the videos that their customers took. So, which legally, I mean, the creator of the video should have the rights to go and play it back on their computer. And that's why it's not violating the DMCA, is because you're the owner of the video. You get to control access to it. So, I haven't followed the camera too much in the last about year. It was more fun just hacking it in the beginning, and rather than keeping up with it. They should have a new crypto algorithm by now, but I haven't seen evidence of that. And there's some cameras where they've removed the USB interface so that it's not just a simple cable. You need to actually get some better hardware. And I bought this morning, and it's got the old USB interface, so there's still plenty of these out there. And then finally, this is a $30 camera. They make a $100 camera that comes with a USB cable software. It's ready to hack. So that way, you don't have to hack it if you want to spend the money. It's an option for a lot of people. So there's some cool things you can do with it. External display. There's a function that we found in one of the cameras that would turn on the LCD, display a picture, beep, wait for the person to push the shutter button, and then it would turn off the LCD. And I commented out the code for the beep, the shutter press, and the turn off LCD. So basically, you could just update new screens, show it up. You could refresh the screen at about 1 Hz rate. So it's perfect for things like top, where you can see what your computer is doing as an external display. So the default on this is a quarter VGA and 20 minutes. And the sensor in there, I guess whatever they found cheapest was VGA. That's what they used. So someone else figured out how to modify it so that it was VGA resolution at 5 minutes, which wouldn't be a really sellable product, but some people wanted higher quality for a short time. So summary, make your own tools, make guesses and assumptions, and then go and cross-check those assumptions and see if they work, see if everything that you assume jives with other parts. There's lots of ways to attack a problem, from hardware, looking at the hardware, to looking at different parts of the software. A lot of it was a group effort. I do part of it, and then other people would come in with other parts that filled in parts where I wasn't interested in attacking it that way, and we finally got it all together. And then persevere and have patience, make it fun, and it'll all come together. So that's it. So I have one more thing. I wrote an article for Make Magazine, and I launched it in a rocket. It's 21 grams, really small, so it fit in the nose cone. And I've got the video for that, of it taking off. And there's my house, and it's coming up there, and where I live. There's a parachute and the body of the rocket. And it comes back down to Earth. That black thing was the sun. If it's too bright, it'll overflow, and you get a black spot. That's slow motion. It's me down there. There's our prairie dog holes. There's a path, the creek. There's us again. And the houses. And then we're just waiting for the nose cone to eject, and then once that does, all hell breaks loose. You can kind of catch the rocket, the parachute, a little tangled up in the cord, and this one had a hard landing. And eventually it comes back down. So that's it. Thank you very much. Some people. Oh, the question was whether did we hack some of the cameras with the video files changed. Yeah, I think someone changed some of the instructional parts and sent it back. I don't know what happened. It'd be a fun hack, yeah. I don't know if they reflashed it totally or whether one of the older cameras had just a special function where it would delete the pictures, but it would keep the operating system the same. So that one was probably pretty vulnerable. Any other questions? Or? Okay. Well, I wasn't making a copy of the firmware. Yeah, you could use that to somebody's hacks to get their firmware out because of the copyright. But I owned the camera, so I was just making a copy. I don't know. But the ultimate thing was the thing that I was distributing was the getting your own videos, which you own copyright to. Hey.
This is Beth.
Hi, Beth.
She worked on the Space Balloon project.
Oh, cool. Okay. I wish I could be there. Oh, perform everything? Someone did that. I don't think it's perfect. Do you have to copy the operating system to the flash memory? try, you probably ruin it, and then you try again. Sorry. Yeah.
No, no, no. It's good enough. Thanks.
Oh, cool. Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, sure, yeah. Smart. Thanks. Okay. Cool. Oh, cool. Okay. Okay. The make, yeah. Yeah, yeah, that's the hard part. But then keep the fun part. I glad that worked out because we did that article and then we sat on it for like 7 months. Yeah, and so by that time, Pure Digital like fixed all our problems. Okay, good. Cool. Okay. Did you use the Kernis key then? Okay. Cool. Yep. I used to be more active on that, but I haven't been so much. So just because I don't like tech support and stuff. Which yeah, I'd like to do, but okay. Would you launch it over? Okay. Okay. Oh. Okay. Yeah. I did that and because before I wired the battery together, the battery bounced the exact same thing, even with actually operating normal. So. Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. Oh, mine killed it permanently though. So yeah, because it was writing the memory and then like the power was pulled and the flash messed up and accidentally started writing in the wrong place. I pulled that off and did the diagnosis to see if it, yeah, there's video was where it shouldn't be. Yeah. Do you use the wadding? Okay. And did you use the? Huh. I did it 3 times only, and all three. Well, one of the guys handed up on the first one, and the other two were okay. Get the original. Sure, yeah. Yeah. Good. Glad it didn't run over. Glad it didn't run over. Oh, cool. Quick announcement. Someone found a phone that was left here in the last talk or so, and if they get to me before we start, I'll hand it over. Otherwise, I'm going to take it up to the registration desk. If you find whoever is missing it, then I will. Okay, that. Great.
They'll get in here. In the form of flying through water. I was just thinking, probably justified.
Maybe this.